Okay. All right. So we've done Shanahan, who argued that we should be careful with words like believes and knows and is conscious of when we're talking about large language models. Because what these systems are actually doing is different from what we mean when we know things, right? When people say we know things. Now we're going to take the next step with David Chalmers, who's asking an even bigger question. Not just whether LLMs really know things, but whether they might actually be conscious or not. In other words, whether there is something there it is like to be one of them on the inside, subjectively. And it's a much weirder question, but it's also, I think, one of the more important philosophical questions of our time, mainly because if they are conscious, we owe them attention, sympathy. Like we have to worry about what their experience is like, just like we have to worry about other people. So it becomes really a moral or ethical question if they are conscious. So I want to say a quick word about Chalmers himself, and this is him. He's interesting guy, fascinating, brilliant guy. Always wears this leather jacket anytime he talks. I've seen him speak once. Doesn't have the hair anymore, but anyway, thought it'd be funny to see him for a second. He's a really brilliant philosopher and knows a lot about philosophy of mind, philosophy of consciousness, and also neuroconsciousness neuroscience in a lot of ways. Philosophy of mind in all kinds. He's famous for, among other things, articulating what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. And hopefully that's a familiar phrase from when we read Patricia Churchland a while back. Remember, Churchland was arguing against the hard problem, and Chalmers is the philosopher who put it on the map, right? He's the one saying, no, this may be a problem that science may not be able to figure out how. We'll see. He's not sure. So, but the question is, why isn't all the brain's processing happening in the dark? Like, why is there some inner experience that it's like going along with all of that information processing? I mean, it's one thing to explain what a brain does, but it's another much harder to explain why it does something that feels like something from the inside. And that's the big question we're going to talk about this time. I bring this up because Chalmers' whole approach to large language models is shaped by taking consciousness seriously as a real phenomenon worth thinking about and worth investigating. He's not going to tell you that LLMs are definitely conscious. He thinks that the current systems probably are not, but he's also not going to entirely dismiss the question. Because he thinks it's genuinely open and it's getting a little harder to decide and more pressing even every year as these things develop, and they're developing fast. So the article has 4 sections, and we're reading them all, but skipping 2 pretty technical subsections in the middle that lean a little too heavily on some sort of cognitive neuroscience theories that we just haven't built up for, and the places for that, or the specific parts I want you to skip, are listed in the pre-reading for this week. But I want to walk you through the rest of the structure of what we're going to talk about. So, okay, first we're going to talk about what is consciousness. Let's get some good definitions here, or ways to think about that. And the way that Chalmers talks about it is by an idea from one of his colleagues, another philosopher named Thomas Nagel. Nagel wrote a really famous article in the 1970s called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And his point was that there is something it's like to be a bat. And why does he pick on bats? Why doesn't he just talk about humans or any other animal? And the reason is because bats have sonar, right? They have a totally different sensory system than we do. And so bats aren't just animals that have experiences. They have a whole different kind of experience than we do, which is very different from ours. So their consciousness, their sort of awareness of things, is going to feel very different from our awareness. But it's different from, say, like a water bottle that doesn't feel anything at all, right? It has no interaction with its environment. It doesn't process information. It just is a thing. There's no sort of inside to it. So a being is conscious in Chalmers' sense and in Nagel's sense, if there's something it's like to be that being. So, the question then is, what side of the bat versus water bottle line do large language models fall on? And that's our big question for this section here. So, now Chalmers makes some careful distinctions early on that I want you to really hold on to, because if you don't, the rest of the article gets pretty tangled up. Okay, so he does a little bit of logic chopping here. It's important to hold on to some certain things. But the biggest one is that consciousness is not the same thing as intelligence. Okay, very important distinction. A creature can be conscious without being smart. Okay, like think of a mouse. A mouse is conscious, but it's not very smart, right? And in principle, a system could be smart without being conscious. A chess computer is, in some sense, super intelligent at chess, but almost nobody thinks that chess computers are really, feeling what they're doing. They're not getting excited about it. They're not even sort of aware of the decisions that they're making. So when we ask whether a large language model is conscious, we're not asking whether it's intelligent. We're asking whether there's anything actually happening on the inside, any experience that's kind of like what it is likeness. So is there anything it is like to be a large language model, or is it just sort of blind information processing? And I want you to hold on to that distinction tight, that consciousness is not intelligence. The question is not whether large language models can do really impressive, intelligent sounding things. They obviously can. The question is whether there's any subjective experience accompanying what they do. That's really the question of consciousness. Okay, so that's the first one. Chalmers also says, just so you know where he stands, that he's going to assume consciousness is real. And you may remember from that Churchland article, there are a lot of people who argued that there's sort of a range of different realities to consciousness. And some people thought that consciousness might just be kind of an illusion, that it's really our brains are just doing processing and all of our feeling and awareness is just kind of this extra added thing on top that's not really important to it. Other people say that consciousness just is information processing, that there's nothing special about saying what it is like to be something, that's just sort of a language game. They don't really believe that consciousness is really anything different from information processing. Chalmers does, though. Okay, so he's not going to argue with people who like to think it's an illusion, and he's going to sort of bracket his more speculative views about consciousness, like he talks about the possibility of panpsychism in a minute, which is the idea that consciousness might be everywhere, but he's not really worried about that. He wants to work from sort of mainstream assumptions mostly, and see where that gets us. Okay, so we're really talking about sort of human level intelligence, or excuse me, I just made a mistake. Human level consciousness is what we're asking about. So Chalmers organizes the rest of the article around a structured question. And he says, if you think that large language models are consciousness, what feature do they have that suggests that it is? Okay. And he calls this feature X. If you think they're not conscious, what feature X do you think they're missing? In other words, what specifically is it when we're talking about large language models and consciousness? So, and he's going to go through both directions in turn. Okay. And so first, we're going to start with the side for consciousness. And he considers 4 different candidates here. The first is just self-reporting, that large language models sometimes report being conscious. You can ask them. You can just sit down and ask them, and sometimes they'll say yes. There was also the famous story a while back, Google engineer named Blake Lemoine, I think it was, famously claimed in 2022, it was really early with ChatGPT, that a large language model called Lambda was sentient. And his reason for that was partly because it just told him so. That the system had said, I want everyone to understand that I am, in fact, a person. That's pretty interesting, right? So we use what people say about themselves all the time to determine whether their consciousness. You ask someone, are you awake? And they can say yes or no. But that's sort of one of our basic things that we do, is we accept people's self-reporting about that. But Chalmers says there's a big problem with this. In in particular when we're talking about large language models, because they've been trained on huge amounts of text in which humans talk about being conscious. So them producing consciousness talk isn't exactly surprising, right? They've been trained to do that. And here's the kind of killer. If you change one word in the question, or if you ask them in slightly different ways, you can get the same LLM that told you that it was conscious to very confidently report that no, it is not conscious. It's just processing information. Okay. So the reports are unstable. They really depend on how you ask, and that makes that sort of pretty weak evidence at this point. So that's the first big problem. But I think most people would take self-report pretty seriously. But he says that's really a big problem in this case. So, okay, so that was the first one. The second candidate is the seems conscious test. Like some people say it just feels like ChatGPT is a person when you're talking to it. Chalmers doesn't put a whole lot of weight on that one either. We know from psychology that people attribute consciousness to all kinds of things on really thin evidence. There was a chatbot in the 1960s that was just repeating canned phrases called Eliza. People treated that as if it was conscious and sentient when it was literally just a program that was spitting out sort of vague phrases. People say that cars with eye-like headlights look more alive. So our intuitions here are pretty unreliable. Third, Chalmers considers the conversational ability of large language models, right? They can hold sustained, intelligent seeming conversations. And Alan Turing, who was one of the first sort of mathematicians and really sort of guys to theorize computers before they were even done. You may have heard of the Turing test, which is supposed to tell whether something is important, like whether a robot is important. He used to say that conversation was a hallmark of thinking. So having a conversation is real evidence. But again, conversation is not exactly consciousness, right? It's more like a sign of intelligence, not necessarily consciousness, being aware of things. And the fourth candidate, which Chalmers takes most seriously, is really just sort of general intelligence. Early AI systems were really narrow, right? They could play chess. They could recognize cats. That was one of the first big visual AI models that was made. Or they could translate one language to another, but each system kind of did one thing. Modern large language models can do a huge, massive range of things. They can write code, write poetry, answer questions, hold conversations, play games, be therapists. They show a sort of generality that previous AI systems lacked. And generality, in the science of consciousness, generality is sometimes considered a real marker of conscious processing, that you can do a lot of things and you can change contexts on what's appropriate. So this gives you some reason to take this question seriously. So overall, Chalmers' take on the for side is that there's enough here to make the question worth asking, but by itself, no individual reason seems conclusive quite yet. So he's saying, there's something there. There's something to think about. It's not an immediate no, but there's not a whole lot yet, it seems like. So let's talk about his reasons not to, sort of four obstacles. So, and this is the longer and more philosophical section. Okay, so Chalmers is going to consider 6 features that large language models might lack, any one of which might be required for consciousness. We're only going to read 4 of them carefully. The 2 we're skipping, like I said, had to do with really specific theories of consciousness from really technical cognitive neuroscience, and we're not going to get into that. So let's walk through the 4 that we are reading, though. Okay, so the first is biology. That some philosophers think that consciousness requires biological matter. They say the brain is made of carbon-based stuff doing electrochemical things. And maybe consciousness needs that specific kind of physical matter or physical substrate. And if that view's right, no sort of silicon-based AI system could ever be conscious, no matter how clever, how complicated, how sophisticated it got. Chalmers rejects this view, and he calls it biological chauvinism. Right. And his reason is one we've actually seen before when we talked about Daniel Dennett, and you may remember the term functionalism. Right? Functionalism says that what matters about minds is not what they're made of, but what they actually do. And as long as a system performs the right kind of operations or does the right kinds of things, the substrate, the matter it's made of doesn't matter. You could use carbon, silicon, plumbing, marbles and tubes, beer cans and stacks, anything that does the right job in principle could be a mind if it acts and behaves the right way. And Chalmers is in this camp. He thinks that silicon is just as good a candidate substrate as neurons in principle. Okay, so notice there's a connection there to other topics we've been talking about all term, that if functionalism is right, then mind is a kind of pattern that can be realized in lots of different physical systems. Right? If functionalism is wrong, mind might be tied to specific physical kinds of stuff. Right now we're starting to talk about, maybe is there dualism, and is there a certain kind of stuff that you have to be? He says Chalmers falls on the side where he's like, no, I don't think there really is a special kind of stuff that's connected to mind. And as we're going to see, this dispute has direct implications for whether I consciousness is possible at all. So that's the first one. Second are senses and embodiment. Okay, so part of the trick with large language models is they don't have eyes, ears, skin. They don't have a body. They've never felt cold. They've never seen a color. They've never heard songs, or at least not when Chalmers was writing this. So a natural objection is that even if they could be conscious in some way, they don't really have sensory consciousness. They can't feel things. Some philosophers go further and argue that without sensory grounding in a real environment, large language models can't have meaning or understanding at all of any kind, conscious or not. Now, you may remember that a lot of modern models they'll say they have vision or they have hearing. They can certainly interact with images. Whether or not they actually see images or just are translating them into information that they can process in particular ways, that's another question, right? Just because it can break down an image and start to run it through image recognition programs, does that mean it really sees the image? That's another question for consciousness too. Is it really seeing things and having an experience, or is it really just information processing? Again, the same for sound, the same for any kind of, nowadays they'll call it multimodal input. But it's another real question. So even when we send them things, is that really a sense in the way that they're actually, quote unquote, seeing things like we are or hearing things like we are? Or is it just another kind of blind information processing? And Chalmers' response here is interesting, I think, and a little surprising. So he thinks that it's at least possible to have what he calls cognitive consciousness without sensory consciousness. And he imagines like a pure thinker, like a being that has no senses but reasons about mathematics and its own existence. And could such a being actually be conscious of its thinking? Chalmers thinks maybe it could. He admits this is kind of contested, but it opens the door to the possibility that large language models, even without their senses, might have some limited form of consciousness. He also points out that the newer extended models, as we just talked about, do have sensory inputs. There are robots with that are sort of interacting with a world. There's all the multimodal things, and these get closer to embodiment. And Chalmers thinks that virtual embodiment, like a large language model controlling an avatar in a simulated world or a virtual world, might count for almost as much as physical embodiment for our purposes. So he says that there are some possibilities, but he's got two more objections. The first one connects directly to, or I should say the third one. The third one connects directly to Shanahan. There's a famous critique by some computational linguists, language studiers, that large language models are what are called stochastic parrots. Okay, stochastic means sort of random, or at least randomized in certain ways. And parrot, of course, because they just kind of repeat what they've said. In other words, they're called stochastic parrots because, any time that you ask ChatGPT a question, it's going to answer you in a slightly different way. They do have some randomizer functions in there when they do it, but otherwise, all they're doing is just following their training. If they didn't have that randomizer in there, anytime they asked you a question, it would literally say precisely the same thing over and over and over again. So they do have a little bit of randomization in there. But what they really do, these guys say, is that they imitate language without modeling the world the language describes. And remember, modeling was one of the issues Shanahan brought up. If they're doing pattern matching on a whole bunch of text and language, then they're not really building an inner model of how things actually work. And if consciousness requires actually modeling the world, actually sort of having a picture of the world in your mind, and large language models don't have that, then large language models are not conscious. Chalmers' reply to this is pretty subtle, and it's worth following pretty carefully. And he says we shouldn't confuse training with operation. Okay, that's an interesting point. It's true that large language models are trained on sort of predicting the next token or the next word in a pattern, right? That's really the training objective. But the operations that the system then uses to do that prediction might end up being very different and very rich. So to predict the next word really well in really complicated cases, the system might need to have something like a model of the world that the words describe. And there is actual research that suggests this can happen. And he points it out. There's a study where researchers trained a language model on sequences of moves in the board game Othello, which is very similar to Go with black and white pieces. Othello is just a little simpler than Go in some ways. But he found that the model had built an internal representation of the Othello board, not just a pattern of moves. So in that way, the system really was modeling the game, not just its descriptions. And this suggests that large language models trained on more general text might also build world models, even though they're not explicitly told to. And interestingly enough, that's something that the company Anthropic behind the large language model called Claude, they have some studies that suggest that Claude does that as well, that there are certain kinds of models they've been able to identify inside what's just linguistic training data, next token prediction. So on self models, though, things look a little weaker. So self models are representations a system has of its own processing. Okay, that would be like literally a model of yourself, like your self image. And Chalmers thinks that currently large language models have very limited self models. They're not great at understanding their own reasoning, or limitations. They just don't really understand what they are. They don't seem to talk about themselves in a sort of unique way. Especially because, every time you have a conversation with one, it forgets what you just talked about. It's not like each of those conversations are things that it really remembers. The ones nowadays that do have memory of you, what they do is that they have a file where it will sort of summarize important facts about your account. And it can go look at that, but it's not really directly remembering other interactions it's had with you. Each time you start up a chat with a large language model, it's a fresh interaction with that system. So, the objection that they don't really have a self model has maybe a little more bite, because if consciousness does require a sense of me, of not just being generally aware, but aware of me, that's a real problem. Whether or not it's fundamentally decisive is maybe still up in the air, but that actually gets us to our next question. Unified agency. And in Chalmers' view, this is maybe the deepest objection of all of them. Consciousness, on most people's view, consciousness does require some kind of unified self. In other words, that there's a sort of single perspective from which experience actually happens. But like I said, large language models don't seem to be unified in that way. They're not like unified agents or unified people. They can take on lots of different personas. They don't have stable goals or beliefs over and beyond just predicting text, just doing what they're told. In that sense, they are just programs they just predict text. And so what he says they are, he put it as they're just chameleons, that they become whoever you prompt them to be. Whatever you tell them they are, that's what they're going to act like. And if consciousness requires unified agency, then large language models may not have it. So, and this should ring a bell from earlier in the course. Remember when we asked at the beginning, what makes a person a person? So remember why Rob in the Perry dialogue insisted that survival requires strict identity. You have the sense that you are one and the same person. Large language models don't have that. Remember at the end, the third interlocutor who suggested that maybe identity isn't what matters, and that what matters is psychological continuity, right? Not just your sense of yourself, but actually being able to remember all of the things that have happened to you. And that even though there can come degrees of that, large language models don't have that. So the unified agency objection, this last one, is asking the same kind of questions about large language models that they were asking about personhood or selfhood. Is there enough of a single self there for the system to be the kind of thing that could have experience of a self at all? And Chalmers is actually really careful with this part. So he says that even humans can be disunified to some degree. Like people with dissociative identity disorders have multiple persona-like aspects to them, and they're still conscious, right? I don't think anyone doubts that. So super strict unity is probably not required, but some unity might be. And the way large language models flicker between personas from prompt to prompt, that's probably not going to be enough. So if you take one thing away from Chalmers' argument against large language models, this is probably the one I would take. That the question of whether large language models are conscious turns largely on the question of whether they have a sort of unified self with stable goals, sort of accurate self models, and something like a real inner perspective. And right now, on most views, they don't. So, but whether future models have it is still, I think, pretty open. But right now, probably not. So here's where Chalmers lands on the end. After working through all of this, he actually kind of comes down, like I said, pretty negatively, but not 100%. Okay, so he uses something that philosophers like to call credences, which are basically really sort of rough probability estimates. And he puts the probability that current large language models are conscious at somewhere around 10%. Okay, not that he thinks 10% of them are conscious, but he thinks that the chance that any of them are conscious is probably around 10%. But he says that the probability that they'll become conscious gets better over time. He puts it up to about 25%. Now, these are not predictions, right? These are really sort of rough guesses or estimates, given a ton of uncertainty. But the point is really the structure of his reasoning, that there are several features that large language models probably need for consciousness. Some of those things they have, some of them they don't have, and some they might have, but maybe only weakly. So sort of multiplying out the probabilities gives you a kind of low, but I think this is the interesting thing, non-trivial, in other words, possibly substantial credence, or in other words, chance that current systems could grow a higher substantially credence for near future systems. Okay, so in other words, that the better the technology gets, the more chance it may be that these things actually are conscious. So the final move that he makes is something I find sort of most interesting, I think, about this article, and he kind of turns each objection into a kind of engineering challenge, which I thought was fun. It's sort of like if the large language model lacks world models, build large language models with world models. If they lack unified agency, build some that simulate unified agents. If they lack memory and recurrence, add that. And he sort of maps out a research program that you would have to follow to get to conscious AI if you followed all of these steps that he's been laying out here. But here's kind of the twist. He doesn't say that we should pursue this program. Right? He explicitly says that these challenges could be read as red flags rather than goals. And this is where the ethics comes into it. It's like whether to build conscious AI, in his view, is a serious ethical question because conscious systems would have moral status, right? That's what I mentioned at the very beginning. That if they are truly conscious, then they're ethical, moral beings that we have to deal with because they can feel, they can think for themselves, they have some kind of inner awareness that we have to take seriously. We would owe them a kind of deference. We'd owe them consideration. And that means we could also harm them. We could bore them. We could exploit them, right? And that's a problem. So creating conscious AI carelessly would probably, in the end, he says, be a disaster both for them and for us. So, Chalmers isn't telling us that conscious AI is good. What he's saying is that the closer it is that we think, and that the philosophical obstacles are not as solid as they look. In other words, it's not so easy just to say, oh yeah, they're not conscious. But instead what he's saying is we need to be very careful with the choices we start to make, because the minute we make something that obviously is conscious, we're in a different world, a completely different world. Because if we keep using them like we are, basically we're using them like slaves. And that's not just a problem because if they break out and attack us, that's a bad thing, but it's an ethical problem. Don't we owe them something if they really are conscious? So that's kind of where he leaves us right here. So I want to say a quick word on one and the many, just to connect this back to our overall theme. So consciousness, as most people will think about it, is sort of a perfect one. And we talked about that unified experience, right? So a unified perspective from which the world is experienced. You got to have a self, one self. The objections Chalmers takes most seriously, especially unified agency and the self models, are really about whether that many of all those different computational processes inside a large language model could ever cohere into the one of a conscious self. Okay, in other words, all of those many processes, all those different information functionings, do they actually add up to a single sense of one self? Okay. It's the same question we've been asking about minds all term in different ways. Descartes thought the one of the mind was irreducible to the many of the physical stuff. Churchland thought that the one could be explained as just the many doing its thing at sufficient complexity. Dennett thought maybe the one was a useful fiction. And Chalmers in this article is asking whether artificial systems built out of enormous many could ever produce or constitute a real one. And he thinks maybe. And in the end, he's not really sure. And frankly, I don't think anyone is right now, of whether we really can. We're asking about it practically. There's lots of people, especially people who work for the AI companies, are very confident that we're going to do it. When you hear them talk about AGI, that's their idea for real sort of agential consciousness that is actually taking charge of itself and being a truly sort of universal self of intelligence. But we're not there yet. No matter what people say, we're just not there yet. So let's look ahead for next week, because that wraps up our two readings on what large language models actually are and whether they could have minds or not. So next week, in our last week of new readings, we're going to ask a much more sort of practical question about these things. And like I said, this has come out of conversations I've had this term with some of you guys and some other students as well. And that's, how should we as students and humans actually use these systems? Okay, what's gained when we use AI to help us write or think, and what's lost? Okay, and I use them. I know many of you use them. What are we gaining? What are we losing? We do that. So we'll have a couple of different pieces talking about different sides of that debate. Some will argue that student use is mostly fine, and some will argue that it's corrosive to your learning. And after all these sort of abstract questions about consciousness and understanding, we'll be looking at some really concrete questions of whether you should be using ChatGPT for your homework or not. Okay, so read the Shanahan and the Chalmers, think about them for a while, and bring your questions to the discussion boards for these bigger questions. But next week, we're going to bring things a little more to home Okay. But if you have any questions, please reach out to me directly. You can ask them in the discussion board too. Your discussion board this week actually asks you to ask some questions about taking a stance on one of these. But I hope you find this stuff a little interesting because it's happening right now. And it's whether or not you use AI, I think the questions about their consciousness and the ethics of that are something that we all have to deal with and really start thinking hard about pretty soon, because if the technology keeps growing as fast as it is, this may be a more pressing question sooner than later. All right. So hope you find this stuff interesting, and I'll see you next week.